about building distributed open source cloud with Ceph and CloudStack, and we will try to give a few tips and tricks for cloud and hosting providers and help them to build the astonishing infrastructure as a service which can help them to get more customers and to expand on the market. Hi Wido, and thank you for joining us today in this video. Can you share a few words about yourself?
Yeah, sure. My name is Wido de Hollander. I'm the co-founder of a Dutch hosting company, started in 2004. Name is Peace Extreme of the company, and we're a big user of Apache CloudStack.
Hello, Giles. Can you introduce yourself?
Hi, Yvette. Yes, I'm Giles. I'm CEO of Shape Blue, also a PMC member and committer in the Apache CloudStack project. At Shape Blue, we provide services, support services, engineering services, consultation services, all focused around Apache CloudStack.
Thank you, Giles and Wido, and great to have you today for this interview. So the cloud and hosting market actually changed dramatically in the last 5 years. What are the challenges which cloud and hosting providers are meeting today?
So what I've been seeing is that uptime is becoming way more relevant. Everybody expected 100% uptime 5 years ago, but nowadays it's really mandatory. We expected it, that it would always work, but it's getting more critical and critical. So even with our lower plans you were offering to customers, they would be more, they would accept a bit of downtime, but nowadays nobody accepts downtime anymore. It just needs to work. So it has become way more difficult to run your cloud infrastructure reliable 24/7. And that's a challenge on hardware and a challenge on software for your team to get this done.
And Giles, can you also share your experience? Your company is working with a lot of cloud providers. Can you share what are they struggling with and how they're trying to become more competitive?
Yeah, I think, the elephant in the room for cloud service providers is the hyperscalers, right? So we all know about these. Well, the largest company in the world, followed by two very other significant companies. And there is this, this general movement, particularly perpetuated by a lot of the people in the analyst world and that sort of thing, towards people sitting on wanting to drive towards the hyperscalers. I think one of the things for our customers who are that next tier down, people like Wido, for example, is about understanding their relevance, and there is a lot of relevance for that next tier down of service provider, but understanding their relevance in this hyperscaler driven world, and just offering cloud services and having some customer loyalty from 10 years before isn't good enough anymore. You have to innovate. You have to provide something that the hyperscalers are not offering to give the value to your customers.
Wido, you're running a hosting provider since 2003, right? Can you share how your infrastructure actually evolved through the years?
Yeah, so if you go back to 2003, I would buy the parts for the servers at the local computer store, screw them together, put them in a rack, and that would be the first servers. And nowadays you're buying these high-end machines from Supermicro and Dell, running your infrastructure on. So it has changed a lot in 2003. And hardware became way more reliable, but actually also cheaper. It was very expensive in the beginning to buy hardware, but nowadays I wouldn't say it's cheap, but it's way more affordable. And to get back what Giles said, indeed, the hyperscalers are what everybody's talking about, but the level down which we are working in is where customers just can pick up the phone and call us and ask us for advice. And if they have an issue, they can call somebody locally, but there's all kinds of things as well around regulations and governments demanding that data is stored locally by a local company, or our customer demands it. It could be healthcare, it could be all kinds of businesses which want their data to be stored locally, also governed by a local company instead of an international company.
As infrastructure is changing and companies need to fight with these hyperscalers, which is quite a hard battle, it all comes to performance and cost and how you can build the ultimate cloud. What are your advices how cloud and hosting providers can benefit from open source technology? And what are the benefits actually of choosing CloudStack compared to other technologies?
I think in a way that there's two questions in there, right? Which is the open source versus proprietary or vendor-driven route, and then there's the specific thing that we're all interested in. Apache CloudStack is sort of what makes that stand out from the crowd. And I think the open source piece is actually quite easy, because without putting words into somebody like Wido's mouth, you want longevity, you want a stable roadmap, you want software that you know is going to be there in a decade's time, because you know you're building large cloud infrastructures, particularly in the service provider space. You know, you're going to have thousands, many tens of thousands of customers there. This is going to be around for some time, and you've got to ensure that your operational costs and ultimately your margin is maintained for a significant period of time. One of the problems with choosing, you know, proprietary vendor-driven software is the vendors will go chasing the revenue, whatever's happening in a particular year. They're not necessarily having that long-term cycle view of things that a service provider. And that's where open source projects come in, because they're driven by their communities. Vendors are often part of those communities, but often by the people who are using it. In this case, is a lot of service providers. So to me, that decision is quite clear. You know, don't choose a technology, even if it looks exciting today, because you don't know what's going to happen in that vendor's roadmap next year, and does that fit your long-term plans? We're then into a world of saying, okay, I'm choosing sort of open source tech. What are you going to choose? And we work in the orchestration side of things here at Shape Blue, and you know, in terms of, you know, sensibly sized open source projects, there's basically three to choose from. There's OpenStack, there's CloudStack, there's OpenNebula. They're three, we could call them competing open source projects. It would be a long conversation. We'll probably go into that later about why you should choose one above the other. But you know, they all have their advantages. They all have their disadvantages. CloudStack for us is about time to value. It's about low cost of ownership. It's about it being a turnkey solution. It's what attracts our customers and service providers to it, because you know, ultimately it's all about margin. And if one of the core pieces of tech in the middle of your stack, the thing that's doing your orchestration, is costing you a lot of money to run, it's always going to hurt your margin. That's why we see service providers coming to CloudStack. Interested to hear your view, because you see it the other way around, right?
Yeah, so there were many answers and questions popping up in my head while you were talking. Is that let me start indeed about why we chose Apache CloudStack. Is that you want to have something which is indeed turnkey, easy to adopt, and easy to extend. And there's a few things which I'm mentioning here. Is that when we started years ago, somebody installed CloudStack and it just worked. He said, "Hey, this is awesome. It works. We can run VMs with this." And we started exploring and started fiddling with it, and it worked. It proved to be working for our company. And as the project then was accepted or donated to the Apache Foundation and accepted by them, it became a solid project which we could rely on as a company for a longer period. Because you do sometimes have open source products which are open source but run by commercial companies, so not governed by something like the ASF, but governed by a commercial company, and they can change the licensing structure at any time they want, so newer releases won't be available to you. And for us as a company, I'm answering two questions, or actually giving you two answers to your two questions. Is why didn't we go for closed source? Because we could have a vendor, which Giles says is going to chase revenue, or the vendor could be bought by somebody, which then starts chasing revenue. So I want to have a stable platform from a technical perspective, but also from a licensing perspective. I want to make sure that when I deploy something today, I can still run on that software in 5 years. And yes, open source provides this to me, but it also provides me that my vendor is not going to double my licenses in 2 years, which will make it very difficult for me as a company to continue, because then I have two options. Either I pay the additional license fee, or I migrate away, which also will cost me a lot of money and will distract me from actually serving my customers, because I would be doing an internal migration for something which is just a paperwork thing. So therefore we chose open source and also chose for CloudStack because the stability the ASF provides us.
Apache CloudStack is an Apache project, right? And the Apache Software Foundation's governance model is all about creating longevity. I describe it as creating organic pieces of software, right? And if you look at the sort of technology that's come out of Apache over the years, web server, Hadoop, Cassandra, these are things that are around for the long term. And the common factor, the reason they've all had that long-term success is that they are these sort of organic pieces of software that haven't been heavily driven very, very rapidly in a certain direction by a vendor. Control, whether it's open source or closed source, vendors can still control projects. And often when you get a project with a load of hype in it at the time, and it's right at the top of Gartner's hype cycle, that's when things start going wrong, because people start building features that they think the market wants to see, instead of building features that actually users and consumers of the software really want. So the fact that CloudStack is this sort of relatively boring thing that just works and people like Wido contribute to it is what makes it successful, right?
On the other hand, can we actually say that when you're using an open source technology like CloudStack, you as a company can set the direction in which this project is going?
Yeah, I mean, that's theoretically possible in any open source project, right? And I think the important bit is removing a vendor's roadmap, commercial roadmap, which is always going to be about revenue for them. So the roadmap of the technology becomes what the people in the community want. Now that community, in some communities, can be made up of lots of vendors, right? I don't think, you can't, as an individual user, sort of control the direction it's going in, but you can certainly have a say. And Wido, I'm interested here because you're quite involved in the CloudStack community yourself personally as well. Do you feel like you're sort of empowered to do that?
Yeah, I would say that that's also great again about the Apache Foundation, is where commercial vendors don't have additional perks over individual committers. Everybody is a committer on a personal level and not as a company. And this allows you to talk with the other people in the project and also steer the project towards something you think is a good idea, but it's not dominated by certain people. So you indeed have a voice in the project, to help with the features and bug fixes. It's really a good way how it works for us with CloudStack. And we have a full-time developer working from Brazil on CloudStack for us as a company, providing back what we take from the project. So we benefit a lot from the project, but we also think that we should do something back for the project to keep it alive. And also this developer fixes bugs for us. He adds features and such. So it's a win-win situation for us.
We looked at the reasons we mentioned earlier, the reasons for choosing open source, particularly in the orchestration space. But one of the misconceptions is open source is free, right? There's no license fees to pay, but it's not necessarily free because to a certain extent, you need to support that software. You need to run that software. Wido and his guy, was Wido saying there, he's employed somebody to do that. We commercially here at ShapeBlue, that's how we make our living, by helping customers do that. But open source isn't free, and I think if people choose it for that reason, that's a mistake. Open source works best for people when they put something back into it.
And when talking for open source technologies, of course, the cloud management is a very important piece, but the storage component, especially for cloud and hosting providers, is also a vital part of their infrastructure. And Wido, you also made a selection of open source technology for your storage layer?
Yeah, indeed. So we indeed went open source because one of the difficulties I experienced in the past with closed source proprietary storage vendors is that you again have the the vendor dictating how you use your hardware and software. So what I've seen happening in the past is way too many storage vendors popped up. They became a hype, and they either went bankrupt or they were bought by a different commercial vendor, which would then change the licensing or declare something end of life. And the difficulty is always that when you say you want to buy storage from them, they always ask you how much you want. And then they say, well, if you're going to be using, let's say, a petabyte in a year, let's buy the petabyte right now. But then I'm spending my capex right away on buying a petabyte while I initially need maybe 100 terabytes of storage. So it's very difficult with those vendors to say, I want to grow as my company grows, because if you do that, then usually your price per gigabyte or terabyte, or how you want to calculate it, is way higher than it would be if you would buy a petabyte from the starting point. However, I would be writing off that full petabyte of storage I bought for a year already before I actually reach that level of utilization. And with open source, I have the freedom to buy the building blocks I need to grow my storage behind my cloud. And what I've seen happening as well with vendors is after 3 years or 5 years, depending on the vendor, they say this product is now end of life, or you need to renew the support contract, which is then an enormous amount of money for a box which is working 99.999% of the time, but you're going to be paying a lot of money for just keeping the box supported by them. And we've seen that it's just not worth it. And open source technologies like Ceph provide us the storage which we need. It grows with us as we scale out our cloud.
What makes the combination between CloudStack and Ceph so good for hosting and cloud providers? Why, if some companies are wondering which technology stack to select, why would you advise them to select exactly this?
It's going to be a bit of a dull answer, but it just works. KVM and Ceph are a golden combination which just provide very reliable and scalable storage. So we use the KVM hypervisor underneath CloudStack attached to Ceph, and Ceph itself can scale from just a few nodes into hundreds of nodes. And the benefit which we have is we have deployments over multiple data centers. And I'm going to be talking about financial things a lot of times, because in the end, financials are what drives a company. Technology is great, but we also need to make a profit. We need to make a margin to be a healthy company. So when we buy Ceph storage, I buy a bunch of machines. I have them running in a data center, but I buy the same machines for all my data centers. So instead of having multiple machines in stock, I just have a very small stock of machines, which I can move between my data centers. And a commercial vendor would never be able to provide me something like that, where I can just take a machine, put it in a data center. And we actually moved machines from data center to data center, decommissioned them in one data center and commissioned them again in the other data center, because we saw that we needed the capacity and we had difficulties with getting new hardware in. And those are the things of flexibility which I really like as a company owner, because my capex stays down because I can just buy the bare minimum which I need to run the company, but I also get the flexibility, and I'm also only writing off on hardware which is actually running in production. I'm not writing off on hardware which is not making me any money. So yeah, this for us is a combination which provides us a very flexible and scalable solution, both technology-wise and financially.
Giles, would you like to add something on the topic on the service provider side?
Yeah, certainly. So, one of the questions service providers ask us when they come and ask us to help design IaaS environments for them is, what do we do about scale? And we always say, okay, so where are you going to be with scale? Where are you going to be in 6 months' time? Where are you going to be in 12 months' time? And we look at the business plan, and it's often got a best case, realistic case, worst case on it. And one thing we know is they're never going to hit their best case, and they're hopefully never going to hit their worst case. They just do not know often when launching these new services what sort of uptake they're going to get. So it's really important from a design perspective that we design an environment that can start small. So just like Wido's saying there, it's not burning money from the start when there's only a handful of users and paying customers in this environment, but then can scale without hitting the margins, right? And so the other thing to say is, we see the world from the CloudStack perspective. So, when our customers say to us, what storage platform should we use? we don't give a single answer, right? You know, because we will discuss whatever we think is going to work best in their environments, and often that comes down to factors like what sort of existing storage they've already got in place, what skill sets they've got, are they going to be able to support these things, what commercial relationships they've got. But starting from a green field, we would be looking to make sure that we recommend something that is scale out and as modular as something like Ceph. And then I suppose the final point is as well is CloudStack doesn't really care too much about the storage underneath. And the simple answer we often give at Shape, you know, as long as it presents NFS, we don't care. Choose whatever storage you want. But actually, there are certain storage technologies, Ceph being one of them, which have got some deeper integration with CloudStack and allow you to do some things that you can't do if it's just effectively a dumb presentation of NFS. So that's one of the things that sets it apart from our perspective as well.
We talked a lot about the costs of building a cloud with Ceph and with CloudStack, but I'm pretty sure that cloud and hosting providers are also concerned about ease of use, ease of implementation. Would you say that this combination of technologies is something which is easy to use by the company and easy to manage? How big teams they need to have in order to manage them?
I think you can't separate the two, because actually the short answer is yes, CloudStack and I know Ceph as well are both two relatively easy to manage technologies, but easy to manage means cheaper, right? So you know, I look at it, you know, from that CEO perspective in terms of cost of ownership, but that cost of ownership is being driven because they're easy to manage and easy to deploy and relatively simple. Wido, I don't know if you've got a different perspective on that.
No, I agree with you. So we have hundreds of hypervisors running, and I think close to 10 petabytes of storage in use at the moment, and it's managed by 3 people. And if you would ask me to double the infrastructure, I could run it with 3, but the same 3 person, maybe add a 4th person. But as we keep scaling, you always have a baseline of people which you need. But afterwards, it doesn't get more difficult as you scale out the system. It just, you get more systems, but you automate it, updating and managing those systems. And managing Ceph and CloudStack, it's not very difficult. Of course, every technology has some things you need to learn about when adopting it. You need to know how it works, but then it just works, it runs, and you manage it, you update it. You run a very reliable infrastructure.
And like everything in life, I suppose that this combination also have some not negatives, but let's say slight disadvantages. So what are the cons of going to open source and running your cloud with CloudStack and Ceph?
What I've seen is that there's a difference between running a cloud and running virtualization. And a lot of people come from a background where they run virtualization and they want to adopt CloudStack or they want to use CloudStack. So they become a customer and they come from like a VMware platform. And they are used on how that technology works, because that's virtualization, where they can say, I want to create a virtual machine, I want to give it an IP, etc., etc., etc. But cloud orchestration is something different. You tell the orchestrator, give me a virtual machine. You describe the virtual machine, and then you tell it, give me this virtual machine. And then CloudStack does its magic, and it provides you the virtual machine with all the information. And that's not what a lot of admins are used to use. Which are used to. So they want to ask CloudStack a lot of things, which CloudStack says, well, I'm going to figure this out for you. Don't ask me. I'll find a solution for you. And this is sometimes conflicts with customers, how they are used to running virtualization. And when they go into a cloud environment, they suddenly have to use APIs. And of course, there's a UI in CloudStack, but API automation makes it way easier. But you need to have confidence in CloudStack that it does what it does at its best. And that's sometimes difficult with convincing people. That's not a negative thing from CloudStack itself. There's nothing wrong with the project, but you need to have people who know how a cloud environment works, who accept that they also need to stay within the boundaries of the cloud environment.
And what if you don't have such people? I suppose that you can also rely on the CloudStack community, which is very well developed, and you can get the support out of it.
Yeah, of course. And there's a lot of integrations for the CloudStack API in many projects, which would make it easier for people to migrate towards CloudStack. But still, it's talking with people, and you need to, I wouldn't say convince, because then it becomes a debate, but you just need to show them how it works in a different way. And once they see the light, then they're all good to go, and they accept it, and they're really happy with using CloudStack.
I think one of the downsides of open source against proprietary is that initial engagement. Because there's a financial driver. If I phone a vendor now and say, hey, I'm interested in your orchestration technology, I'm going to have people in my office quite quickly. I'm going to have a lot of people running a lot of demos for me. With open source projects, because that profit driver, that revenue driver isn't there, it can sometimes be a little bit daunting. Where do you start with this technology? We're okay in CloudStack. We've got a really friendly community, and we see new users popping up all the time and saying, hi, we want to try the software, and can you give me some tips and tricks? But I think, sometimes right from day one, it isn't always obvious where you need to go, who you need to speak to get the software running on day one.
Is the combination between CloudStack and Ceph also giving a solution to the problem with hardware refresh cycles and vendor walk-in to a specific hardware?
I would say so, yeah, because we run a cloud environment mixed with Supermicro and Dell. We always keep balancing the two out, and when we send out a quote, it goes to both, and then we choose whoever gives us the best offer. So we run a mixture, and usually if you run, I'm not going to name names, but if you run with a commercial virtualization product with hardware underneath it, they will support it for X amount of time, and after that time, they say, this machine is now, where I go again, end of life, we no longer support this machine. So please replace the machines. And that's usually 5 years when you need to replace them. And I would say that modern hardware is not written off after 5 years. So financially, it might be written off, but it can run for 6, 7, 8 years, depending on what the use case for the hardware is. And I always say, as long as the power supplies are okay, the memory is okay, it's not giving errors, you keep the hardware running if it makes sense financially. And usually it makes sense. We have many background workloads, which we then move to the previous generation hardware. I always try to keep away from the term old hardware. I always say previous generation. So we run the new services on the current generation, and then the other services go towards the previous generation. And financially, it makes a lot of sense to run on that hardware.
And I would say, actually, I mean, one of the actual use cases of CloudStack, not necessarily just in the service provider world, but in the enterprise world as well, is about removing vendor lock-in. So we're getting use cases which is around the hypervisor, right? So people who have been, again, without naming any specific vendors, people are looking for a roadmap to move away from one very expensive hypervisor vendor to start to move some workloads towards another hypervisor. Now, that's going to be a big change in a lot of organizations, particularly in terms of people who are consuming that virtualization layer. And what CloudStack can do is provide an abstraction on top, because it's designed to speak to infrastructure and speak to hypervisors below it and present that as a simple common API. And because CloudStack supports a whole range of hypervisors, it actually allows that and prevents that lock-in. So, like Wido saying, whether that's at the hardware level, whether that's at the underlying hypervisor level, what CloudStack is giving as an open source technology is some protection against that lock-in, right?
At the end of this conversation, if we manage to attract the attention of some companies who would like to migrate to CloudStack and Ceph, can you summarize it like a short process? What are the steps they need to make so that they can have a successful migration? And in what time period do you think they will be able to migrate successfully?
I think that the devil is always in the detail. We have to be careful with these answers, but it depends where they're migrating from, what is their starting point. But if we assume that you've got somebody with a non-orchestrated environment, some sort of virtualized environment, it's relatively straightforward, and it does depend on the hypervisor, but it's a relatively straightforward process. It's a question of getting the design of the CloudStack environment right. A lot of that is thinking about future scale or what have you. And then it's just a question of coming up with a migration plan of how are they going to move those existing virtualized workloads into an orchestrated environment. And there's a number of different options there. I mean, we've got recent functionality came along in CloudStack 4.14, 4.15, which lets you point at, say, a VMware vSphere environment and just hoover it up there and then at a run of one command. So it can be as simple as that. There can be some more complicated routes. On the storage side, I guess, Wido, you're probably the best person to answer that, having probably done it a few times.
Yeah, but it usually goes in combination where you migrate towards Apache CloudStack, and while you're doing so, you're also migrating to a new storage platform. But I want to say from the starting point is that you should have your must-haves, should-haves, and could-haves very clear. And if you want to check all the boxes, so if you put everything in the must-have, then it might be very difficult to migrate because you are used to your current technology. And if you start ticking all the boxes saying, hey, my current technology does it in way A or B, it needs to work exactly the same in my new platform. And a cloud orchestration is different than a regular virtualization platform. And that's what I said previously as well. You need to accept that it works a bit different. And then then you have a great starting point. So be very clear what features you need and deploy a proof of concept, because that's also very relatively easy. On a single server, you can deploy a proof of concept with CloudStack and see that it just works for you. And then you see that it has all the features you need, and then just start deploying. And when you start migrating, as I said, you will migrate the VM towards CloudStack, and then you also migrate the storage. So then I would say deploy Ceph.
I agree with most of what you say there. There's one point I sort of disagree with, which is that the bit you said right at the beginning, which is people tend to move their orchestration platform and their storage at the same time. From my experience, that isn't often the case. And that isn't often the case because the nature of these organizations have got to generally have a certain amount of scale, and they've already got normally a storage platform which is suitable for them now, or they might not have, but that would be seen often as a separate project. So from our experience, when deploying the orchestration side of things, the storage often stays consistent. We see a different cycle of changing the storage at a different time, if that makes sense. But that's just a relatively sort of a timing thing.
Yeah, indeed. So, and one thing I would like to add is that when you look at a lot of commercial products, they are actually based on open source products as well. It's just open source with a nice jacket around it, and it's being sold. And what you see is that vendors tend to give the open source features a different name in the commercial product. So people start searching, saying, hey, does CloudStack support feature X? And then somebody says, well, no, it doesn't support feature X. Well, it actually does, but somebody's asking for the commercial feature and not for the actual feature of the open source project. So you have all the shiny brochures of your commercial vendor telling you all the fancy features it has. And CloudStack probably has it as well, but just under a different name.